Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
from Southeast Asia.
Good morning to DurianASEAN listeners. You're with Grace at Monday Morning Matters from ASEAN Breakfast Call, where we discuss issues in Southeast Asia. So today the topic, Malaysia's silence and the boat people crisis, our topic today, and Rohingya issues in Southeast Asia is actually not new, and in fact this has been around for decades. So they are denied basic services and their movements are severely restricted. The oppression of the Rohingya has gradually intensified since the process of reforms introduced by the President Thein Sein in 2011. Now the President of Thailand government is trying to get the whole Rohingya's minority to get out of Burma. And in fact, this Burmese government is doing a genocidal act against the Rohingyas by denying rights to work, rights to move, rights to access education, and rights to vote. The government is pushing Rohingyas to the camps and denying access to aid, giving them two options only. It's either live in camps or leave from Burma. So firstly, Thailand, Malaysia, and as well as Indonesia, they have to immediately stop pushing boats and have to send out their navies to find the remaining boats and provide them with the humanitarian assistance. And in fact, it is UN, EU, US and UK have to cooperate with ASEAN countries to address the root cause of the problem. Even though the government expressed that we are not the root of the problem, but which is a very irresponsible response coming from one of the ASEAN countries and also being the chair of ASEAN this year. Well, the foundation of this cooperation among this organization is to stop persecution against the Rohingyas in Burma. And for the international community, the stronger action is urgently needed to protect the Rohingyas of Burma.
The United Nations has urged Thailand, Indonesia and Malaysia not to push boats carrying migrants back out to sea, describing that policy as appalling. The comments came after about 800 illegal migrants arrived in Indonesia, many of them Muslims fleeing persecution in Burma, also known as Myanmar. Well, with me now is Tan Kin. He's president of the Rohingya Refugee Council, the organisation here in the UK, and he settled in the UK 10 years ago from Burma. It's good of you to come in.
Thank you.
I know that you know better than most the misery of these people because you actually spoke to some people on the boats the other day.
Yes.
And what just describe that.
It's a very tragic moment when I talked with them, and it's the way they are screaming, we need help, we want, please save our lives, and we are without food and water about 5 to 6 days, and so please, we need help from international community. That's the way they are crying out.
How has it got to this? Who are these people that are in such desperate need that they make this journey?
Well, if you ask who are these people, if we look back and see, these are the original native people of Arkhana State, western part of Burma. They are facing systematic ethnic cleansing plan from the Burmese government for decades, and after this President Thein Sein government came, they are imposing more restriction on movement, marriage, education, and creating, popular violence, violence and pushing them to the camps, and their houses were burned down, thousands of Rohingya were killed, and 140,000 Rohingya IDPs now. And so the government is deliberately impoverishment doing for the Rohingyas, and by denying their legal status, and the government is intentionally pushing them to the camps and blocking of aid, and so their policy is whether you want to stay in camps or whether you want to leave from the country.
Where are they trying to get to? Where is their ultimate destination?
Well, they are trying to look for somewhere where they can get safety and security and shelter. So that is where they are heading to. But unfortunately, it's very tragic moment. This Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, they are pushing out the boats. And so we are calling here international community. We need help, a stronger action to get them, rescue them to the lands and provide them humanitarian assistance. And also these genocidal acts are facing these people, and so like international community, US, UK, EU, they have to call on Burmese government to address, together with coordination of ASEAN, to address the root cause of the problem. Why these people are fleeing from the country? So this is the main important point. They are facing decades of persecution, and
But very quickly, I mean, what was your reaction when you heard that what the authorities were doing was seeing these boats and then pushing them further away?
Yeah, this is very surprising and shocking the way they're doing. As a human beings, at least they should provide them, shelter to them first, where they are risking with their lives. So firstly, we are calling on, search and rescue them to the, and bring, provide their, bring their navies to the sea and bring them to the land, and after that, they have to provide humanitarian assistance. So addressing the root cause is the most important point here, by international community, a stronger action. So this is happening because we have seen that international community has been so far 3 years going on, not taking a stronger action. Instead, they are quite, encouraging President Thein government some reforms are going on.
Need to see some action.
We are the people, a kind of extinction, going in danger of extinction. So we need international help.
Okay, and it's good of you to come and talk about it. Thank you very much.
That was a short interview that was conducted under BBC with Brooke President Tun Kind. Well, going back to these issues regarding Rohingya, there are a few facts that we'd like to share before going further to discuss with our guest speaker today in depth. First, there are less than 2 million Rohingyas worldwide. Myanmar is home to almost 800,000 people. Others are scattered around the region in countries like Malaysia, Thailand, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Saudi Arabia. The Rohingyas adrift in the overcrowded, unsanitized, and very poor conditioned boat for weeks, and to date, dozens have died, and some of these bodies are dumped off the boat into the sea, which is very cruel and it is inhumane, and no human would choose to endanger the lives of their lives and also their families if given a choice. And also they are persecuted simply because they are Muslims. Villages burned to the ground, women raped, and the children are forced to join the army. A men are thrown into burning fire alive. They are not treated as human beings, and we don't seem to find the elements of treating them as a one life creature. And 90% of Rohingyas in Myanmar, they reside in the Rakhine or Arakan. They have been denied the citizenship since a 1982 citizenship legislation was enacted. This means that they are stateless. They are not allowed to have more than 2 children, and they are confined within Rakhine. And of course, no travel to other states without approval. So the recent incident that was spotted in Langkawi. So Langkawi had been in this limelight for the last 1 week after over 1,000 Bangladeshis and Rohingyas from Myanmar landed illegally last week, with the figures reported to be larger ever, and also one of the largest figure to date. The landing incident occurred after the neighboring Thailand went on to the massive crackdown of a larger-scale human trafficking syndicate following the discovery of over 30 bodies buried in the southern part of the country last week. In fact, this resort island was shocked by the mass arrival of illegal immigrants when one of the wooden boats carrying them ran around on the west side of the island. So this international tourism destination, Langkawi, has fallen to face are these issues and what will happen in the near future to Rohingya and others who are in this crisis at the moment. Today, DurianASEAN invited a speaker who can share and give us insight of these ongoing and long-term issues that has been neglected by the government and people. She is a research associate with Humanitarian Policy Group at the London-based Overseas Development Institute, also an expert on Myanmar, Rohingya and ASEAN role in humanitarian crisis. Her name is Lilianne Fan, and indeed she will be there at the DurianASEAN to discuss further on these issues after this break. So stay tuned.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
From Southeast Asia.
Good morning, welcome back to DurianASEAN. You're still at the Monday Morning Matters with Grace. So, like I shortly mentioned before, we have invited a speaker who can share in depth regarding these issues, Rohingya, that has been happening for the past week. And she's a research associate with Humanitarian Policy Group at the London-based Overseas Development Institute. And she's also an expert on Myanmar, Rohingya, and ASEAN role in the humanitarian crisis. Her name is Lilianne Fan, and good morning.
Good morning, Grace.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
All right. So before we start this discussion, could you just briefly explain about your background and how you come to do some research on these particular issues?
Well, I've actually been tracking the issue of the Rohingya refugee crisis and statelessness crisis for quite a long time now. And actually, I first started to learn about the Rohingya when I was working in Malaysia, actually, with refugees.
Right.
And this, it was about 10, 15 years ago. So in fact, I think the first thing all of us need to remember is that this is really not a new crisis.
Yes.
At all. And of course, Malaysians know that because Malaysia really does host one of the largest populations of refugees, migrants from Myanmar in general, but certainly also from Rakhine State, and particularly the Rohingya. So this is not a new crisis. This is a crisis that's been happening for a long time, but I think that there's been an escalation, certainly for several reasons. One is that, in fact, we've seen, of course, that there's been improvements in Myanmar in many ways in the last few years since Myanmar has embarked in on its reform process, right, the democratic reform process and governance reform process. And in many ways, Myanmar is improving. Economically, it's improving. Politically, the democratic system is getting far more accountable. But progress is uneven. And I think, one of the clearest areas where there's been actually a backsliding, I would say, and many people would say, is really the situation in Rakhine State and this inability to address, not only the statelessness problem, but also really just to be able to create a viable livelihood situation and a living situation for the Rohingya in particular. So this exodus that you see has actually gotten worse over the last few years, and particularly over the last 2 years, because there's been communal violence that has increased, and there's a very serious humanitarian crisis within Rakhine State as we speak, and this is why it's becoming very difficult for Rohingya. It was difficult already, but I think it's becoming actually much more difficult in the last few years for the Rohingya in Myanmar.
Yes, it is true that the Myanmar, the country itself, they only have open to welcome more foreign investors when it comes to economic growth. However, on the other side, the Rohingya, this ethnic minority, they have been suffering for the longest time, and then they have been neglected by the government. In fact, they're only given the two choices, right? Either leave the country or just stay in the camp.
Well, it's a little bit more it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, I do think that there's been a level of genuineness and sincerity about Myanmar's opening up. But the problem is that it's really uneven. And I think opening up and, improving the situation in some aspects, which Myanmar has been trying to do. I wouldn't say it succeeded in everything, but I think there has been a genuine attempt to, to conduct reforms. And of course, it's incredibly challenging. I mean, Myanmar is a very complicated country, socially, politically, economically, historically, culturally. It's very complicated. Yeah. For example, there's a peace process that's going on right now with 14 armed groups, 14 armed insurgent groups, and these are the rebel groups who've been fighting for many, many decades, actually, particularly in the east and in the north. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's incredibly challenging for any government to try to deal with a peace process with one armed group, but Myanmar's trying to develop this peace process very ambitiously with 14 at the same time. So it is incredibly challenging. There's no easy road to that. But I think that what's very disturbing about this unevenness is the human cost, really. And as a humanitarian, mm-hmm. It's really quite devastating to see the levels of deprivation and suffering that are continuing to take place in Rakhine State. And the situation in Rakhine State, there are camps, there are displaced people in these camps, both Rakhine Buddhists as well as Rohingya Muslims. Mm-hmm. But the majority of Rohingya Muslims are actually not living in camps, they're living in villages. However, many of these villages have situations which are almost like camps because they do not have permission to actually move around very much, and because this population is actually stateless, they've mm-hmm. not been granted citizenship or even the recognition of basic rights. They have to negotiate for everything. They have to negotiate for really basic things like access to healthcare, for example, mm-hmm. access to basic education, even marriage. Permission is needed for marriage. Movement from one village to another is also needed. And I would say that, there's the aid community in Rakhine State has been working really hard. And I would even say that the state government in the last year mm-hmm. or so has actually tried to stabilize the situation. So I'm not one of those who says that the government isn't doing anything, but it's really not. It's just really not adequate. I mean, it's a very complex problem in Rakhine State. Mm-hmm. The problem is primarily government policy, but it's also a problem of real social discrimination and hostility against the Rohingya. So and that needs to be understood in the context of deep poverty. Mm-hmm. Rakhine State is one of the poorest states in Myanmar. It's actually the second poorest. Some even say the first. The most poorest state in mm-hmm. Myanmar. So it really needs development across the board. It needs poverty reduction across the board for the Rohingya as well as for the Rakhine, mm-hmm. The Rakhine Buddhists as well.
Like you said, mentioned Lilianne before, that Malaysia still holds the one of the largest population when it comes to refugees.
Yeah,
but then how
right.
they are treated in Malaysia is also pretty much unfair with the poor conditions, the living conditions in Malaysia.
Well, I would say that in Malaysia it's actually mixed. The thing is, the problem, of course, with most ASEAN countries mm-hmm. is that because we're not signatories to the Refugee Convention, mm-hmm. we don't really have proper domestic or regional legal frameworks to really cover the aspects of protection for refugees. So what we do is we treat refugees legally mm-hmm. as we would other migrants, and there are problems with that because migrants come to another country primarily to seek work.
Right.
Refugees come to another country because they have no choice but to leave, mm-hmm. and they are usually fleeing conflict, really devastating situations of persecution, states which are not able to protect them. So a refugee situation is so much more, it is a much more harrowing situation, and it's one where it's a legal category where people do not have protection from their own state, and that is why they leave. So ideally, it would be really, I think, very positive to see ASEAN move in that direction, and Malaysia in particular, because, in fact, there are so many refugees in Malaysia. And I would say it's mixed. It's a mixed situation in Malaysia, because the government actually recognizes the fact, even if it's informally, it recognizes the plight of the Rohingya, and it recognizes, well, I think actually even formally, I mean, you heard the Prime Minister's statement just over the last few days. I mean, there's a real recognition of the suffering of the Rohingya and of these people, but I think because we don't have a refugee framework legally, it becomes difficult to come up with a consistent policy of how to treat them. But I would say that actually the conditions of many Rohingya in Malaysia are actually not that bad. I mean, the problem is that there are big concerns, very serious concerns for the refugees who are being held in detention. And I think that's where it becomes problematic, because you really should be making distinctions between illegal migrants, if you like, and refugees. And then, secondly, I believe actually that there's been a bit of progress on Malaysia's recognition of the fact that actually there were a lot of minors. There were a lot of children who were actually also being detained in detention centres, and Malaysia has now started a commission on trying to resolve this issue, trying to look for alternatives to detention for migrant children. This is not just for the Rohingya, it's for all migrant children. And that's a very important step. The Malaysian government is working with non-governmental organizations. It's actually a cross-institutional commission, which is really important. So I do think that Malaysia understands some of these challenges. Of course, it deals with these challenges mainly as a migration problem, not specifically as a refugee problem. So I think that, really I would love to see Malaysia take the lead, with other countries that are really receiving a lot of refugees, including Thailand and of course now Indonesia as well. We've actually come a long way in ASEAN to develop regional frameworks on serious issues that affect many of our countries at a regional level. I don't see why at this stage of our development we can't start thinking about really how to come up with a regional policy framework to guide domestic governments within ASEAN to really come up with their own domestic laws, which are actually more in line with international standards.
Well, ASEAN being the chair of ASEAN, Malaysia being a ASEAN chair this year, it is very important for our nation to bring this importance to this issue, to come up with the solutions or even regulations or policies. But why these three nations, particularly Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, they have turned away the both people and they stay sort of in the silent on the humanitarian crisis happening right now?
Well, I would say two things. Number one, there have been, pushbacks which have been very, very alarming. And from a humanitarian point of view, it's clear that some of these countries, including Malaysia, have actually given some aid, some relief to these boats. And for the countries who did that, including to Malaysia, I would say thank you for giving at least a little bit of life-saving aid to these people. But I would also say that it's really not adequate, and I think we need to understand the conditions that these people are in at the moment.
Could you elaborate on the condition of these people on the boat at the moment?
Absolutely. I mean, it's people have been on these boats for 3 months now. Number one, first of all, when people get on these boats, they're already in very vulnerable conditions, particularly the ones coming directly from Rakhine State, from Myanmar. The nutrition levels in Rakhine State, for example, for the Rohingya are some of the worst in the world. I'm not even talking about this region or Asia. In the world, they're some of the worst. People have gone through, years of trauma and persecution and deprivation generally, and poverty in Rakhine State. And so by the time people get on these boats, they're already in very difficult situations. Many of them are already suffering very serious health problems. They then have stayed on this boat for months. Some, between 2 to 3 months, many of them. And these boats are in terrible conditions. I mean, they're in cramped conditions with, hundreds, sometimes some boats have thousands of people cramped together like sardines with no adequate, sanitation facilities. I mean, incredibly difficult situations. People, of course, have developed enormous health complications. I mean, respiratory problems, digestion problems, all kinds of really, really serious issues have been, and you can see actually what's the kind of conditions people are in. If you look at the survivors who have arrived in Aceh in Indonesia, there are currently more than 1,400 of these survivors who've now arrived in Aceh over the last 10 days. Right. And, it's really shocking to see their conditions, particularly the last boat that arrived in Langsa in East Aceh. I mean, people are really at the brink of starvation. Oh no! And it's really terrible. I mean, I'm sure that you can look at these pictures online, but it's shocking to see that this is happening within Southeast Asia. We are a region in the world which is rising in terms of economic growth and so-called stability, and it's actually really completely unacceptable that we have starving populations of refugees and migrants, and we're not making it a priority to just get them the most life-saving aid. And I think, fine, I mean, I understand, of course, there are big concerns that these governments in the region have about, just taking people in and being expected to care for them, especially if the source of the problem is not being addressed adequately. I completely understand that, and I think that is right. We have to come up with a regional solution. But the first priority should really be saving people's lives. And I think that we need to come up with a framework and a kind of a mechanism within ASEAN, or even just a bilateral or a multi-state intervention somehow that allows countries to be able to conduct search and rescue, to be able to conduct disembarkation on humanitarian grounds, get people urgent medical treatment, and then you can talk about, how you process the migration problems and how we're going to deal with this as a region. And I really do think that, I would plead with governments currently to please not turn boats away. I do think, I saw the photographs of the Malaysian Navy providing aid yesterday to this very desperate boat, which has actually been stranded at sea and, without aid for many, many days now. And I have to say that, I saw that there was dignity that was given to these people. I do think that the Malaysian government is really struggling with what to do. I think that that's the case also in Thailand. That Thailand is trying to think of ways to approach this. So I wouldn't say that it's a complete disregard. Indonesia, of course, has been actually very good. I mean, Indonesia is now, as I said, hosting more than 1,000, almost 1,500 of these desperate people, and is trying their best. But we need a regional solution. I mean, you can't solve this problem, number one, without Myanmar. And I think the big challenge now is bringing Myanmar to the table and trying to say to them, look, ASEAN, is incredibly concerned. We need to solve this together. But also, ASEAN is ready to help you. I mean, ASEAN is ready to stand next to Myanmar and say, let us help you improve the situation in Rakhine State. Let's help you ensure that you don't have a situation where people don't feel that they can live in this country and in this state because they have absolutely no protection or no prospects of a future. There are actually some fairly easy steps that can be taken on a policy level from the Myanmar government side to improve the situation a little bit. Of course, the longer-term solution ultimately will take a very long time, but there are some immediate things that they can do, and I really think ASEAN needs to come behind Myanmar and really put some pressure on it and say, we can't allow this to happen. We have to sit down and solve this problem together, and they have to be part of that solution.
For sure. I mean, ASEAN as one single market or one organization will need to come up with the solution and policies to help out these people immediately. But at the same time, these people on the boat, just to survive, nowadays they just throw themselves into the sea because they just want to survive and to make more space for them to stay in the boat. And the condition is getting worse, and just by looking at the pictures, they're very disturbing. So do you think that this all non-interference approach in an ASEAN Charter has failed sort of the ASEAN community and resulted in the greater human rights or violations?
I think it's really time, and in fact, many senior level figures in ASEAN have said this as well, including our former Prime Minister Abdullah Badawi, have called on ASEAN to actually reconsider this principle of absolute non-interference. And there's actually been a call by senior leaders, former heads of states, as well as former foreign ministers, including Tan Sri Said Hamid Alba, to in fact really try to reconsider the non-interference principle in cases of severe human rights violations. And this was a statement that was made by these former ASEAN ministers and heads of states just before the ASEAN summit that just took place in Kuala Lumpur last month. So I think that there is, the will and the understanding from some very senior people within the ASEAN community that this is an inadequate and outdated model. We can't be absolutist, right? I mean, there's certainly a reason why this principle emerged, but we are maturing as a community, and I think we should really be at the point where we are not putting human lives at risk, at such great risk, and hiding behind this principle. I mean, you can't apply principles which are supposed to be supporting the community in the name of security and mutual respect for sovereignty when there are literally hundreds of people dying at your doorstep. I mean, this is an enormous embarrassment, I think, for the entire ASEAN region. Yes. ASEAN citizens are shocked and horrified at this, and I think that through every single ASEAN country that's affected by this is absolutely horrified. The international community is horrified. So people are asking, what is happening? Why aren't the ASEAN governments doing anything? And again, I think that the ASEAN governments, at least, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, are doing something. I don't think that anybody's doing enough at the moment. Right. And I do think that a regional solution is needed. I would say that I think the calls that some of these countries have made have been really important. Thailand has really tried to crack down on the trafficking problem. They've called for an urgent meeting on the 29th, it's mainly to look at trafficking, but also the root causes of this problem. That's really important. Malaysia has said on a few occasions that this needs to be an ASEAN-led solution. That's very important, but I would really like to see the concrete next steps of that. Of course. What does that mean? Does that mean that we're calling for in ASEAN an extraordinary special meeting of ASEAN foreign ministers? What are the proposed solutions that ASEAN is going to come up with? There are many of us who are trying to help ASEAN and are willing to help ASEAN think through these issues, but we would really like to see some clarity in terms of concrete next steps that are going to be taken to really address this issue, because it's really getting to the point where there have already been so many lives that are lost, and it's really becoming a regional embarrassment. Yes,
like you mentioned before, this issue is not a new problem. It's been going on for decades, and it's really disappointing. As an ASEAN community, it's been there, but it wasn't really highlighted, and sometimes the issues was just kept on silent, and hoping that something will happen for them, especially for Rohingya community, to solve this issue. But however, nothing was done until now, that only the media has been highlighting these issues and over social media, and the people are just getting to know, and that they are really aware of what's happening, especially from the pictures, and there are lots of debates going on social media, and this really saddens and also the image of ASEAN to other countries is really embarrassing.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think if there's anything that's encouraging in this crisis, to me, it's the fact that the citizens of ASEAN are really learning about this problem, and there's no way to ignore it anymore, if you like. And this is because as you rightly pointed out, this is not a new problem. You know, there have been boats that have been stranded at sea before. There have been situations where you know, there have been drownings at sea. There have been you know, very difficult situations, and of course, as we've seen in Thailand, I mean, the shock of, you know, mass graves and jungle camps where people were literally being starved. I mean, really awful things that are happening in the ASEAN region today. And I think it's shocked the public. It's shocked the governments as well. But I think, you know, the fact that these are issues that now are really dominating the concern of the ASEAN public. And, you know, we are asking ourselves as an ASEAN community, what is it that we can accept in terms of our own humanity? And what does it mean to be a member of the ASEAN community? I mean, you know, are we going to accept tolerating this kind of treatment for anybody? You know, whether you're, you know, a stateless person or a refugee or a migrant, you know, human beings cannot be treated this way. And I think that ASEAN citizens everywhere are really saying, you know, we do not want these types of things happening in our name, which is really an important stance to take. And therefore, I think, you know, to work with our governments to really try to, you know, certainly put a level of pressure, but also cooperate and constructively engage with our governments to say, you know, what really practically can we do, particularly because, you know, this issue in particular for the Rohingya is a problem that, you know, really is coming from Myanmar, and Myanmar is not the easiest country to engage with. So it is a member state of ASEAN. You know, there have been problems with Myanmar before. If you might remember that in 2008, there was this enormous cyclone that hit the Irrawaddy Delta in Myanmar, and in fact, you know, there was a real issue in terms of getting aid to the affected areas quickly. And ASEAN did step in. I mean, this is the thing, you know, it's not as if ASEAN shouldn't feel paralyzed. And, you know, it's really no excuse that not having a legal policy framework on refugees, and it's not an excuse to not get engaged, because ASEAN's done it before. And I think we proved that with the ASEAN engagement for Cyclone Nargis. And this maybe wasn't as well known as it should have been, but ASEAN played a critical role in coordinating aid relief to the affected areas in the Delta. For 2 years, there was a mandate given to ASEAN to lead the coordination effort for providing relief and recovery efforts, and overseeing these efforts of providing humanitarian and recovery relief to the cyclone-affected areas, together with the Myanmar government and the United Nations and wider international community. But ASEAN was really in the lead, and that's a mechanism which, you know, came about because of a crisis. So we can look at mechanisms and you know, create a response that is needed in the face of a crisis. And I think we should also not forget that, you know, this is not the first boat people crisis that the region has faced. I mean, it's you know, really, we're talking about you know, the anniversary as well of the fall of Saigon, and, you know, this massive outflow of Vietnamese refugees to the entire region. And Malaysia was a very big receiving country, Indonesia as well, many countries in the region actually. So there was a regional framework. You know, there was actually a steering committee that was set up to coordinate the response across these countries. You know, there was a process that was set up, there was a conference that was held, and you know, why can't we do something like that now? There's absolutely no reason why we can't. And I think it's really a question of political will. Who's going to take who's going to step out as the leader and the champion to drive this process? And that is what I would like to see. It's, you know, the statements, I think I'm not I think that we've had enough statements, and the statements actually haven't been that bad, you know, from the ASEAN leaders. I think that we really need concrete action right now, both in a humanitarian point of view of, please let these people disembark, and for heaven's sake, let's give them the medical attention they need, and more than just a little bit of relief on the boat. People need to disembark urgently. They are in incredibly urgent medical conditions. There are people dying every day. As you said, you know, people are being they're dying at sea and being thrown off board. But people, you know, the case in in Aceh, one of the boats that arrived in Aceh just a few days ago, there was a fight that broke out on the boat because there was no food. People actually were starting to kill each other on the boat because there was insufficient food and water. I mean, we are putting people's lives, first of all, in great danger, and we are reducing them to this level of, absolute descent into violence just to survive. And it's absolutely unacceptable and horrific, quite frankly. So, the first thing we need to do is really take action on our humanitarian concerns, get people off those boats and get them treatment, number one. Number two, hold an urgent conference with leaders who are really decision makers, heads of states and foreign ministers in this region, and come up with a solution. And this cannot be a side discussion, had in the corridors and in the margins of, a regular ASEAN meeting. This really needs to be a dedicated meeting, special meeting, specifically to address this issue that the region is facing right now. There's no reason we can't do that. It really is all about political will.
You've explained how ASEAN did cooperate and that they were really helpful in terms of issues that happened within Southeast Asia before. So regarding this issue, particularly Rohingya issue, we really need to have some kind of mechanism, and then all those leaders can come up with a solution if they did before. But then my question here is, will they be able to execute the plans in an appropriate manner and to be able to really take an immediate actions on this, because they need help immediately, all this Rohingya community on the boat. And like you mentioned, people are dying every day, even up to the point that they are starving, and then they are at the thirst situation. They even drink their own urine at on the boat, and it's just really terrifying and really disturbing. But then, do you think, or have you been receiving any feedbacks from citizens, people, regarding these issues, and do they understand these issues properly?
I think that in terms of the public, people are really learning, and I've received a lot of communication, a lot of questions, a lot of interest to learn about this issue more, and that's so encouraging. It's really good to see that people are educating themselves about this problem. First of all, there's an enormous humanitarian concern amongst the ASEAN public, and I think that to me is very hopeful. You even see that the way the people in Aceh, Indonesia, have received these refugees who've actually been able, and the migrants who've actually been able to come ashore. It's an incredible outpouring of solidarity and concern. People are giving everything they can. Aceh, as you remember, is a very poor province as well, that was affected both by a tsunami as well as a long conflict itself. So, and even in that situation, people are giving whatever they have. The Achenese, have been so generous. They've actually been going to these camps, bringing food, bringing clothes, bringing, all kinds of relief items to this population, trying to help in any way they can. It was actually the fishermen of Aceh who saved 700 people at sea just a few days ago and brought them in because while they were scouting, they understood that there were refugees and migrants out there, and they actually went out to look for them. And I think that is incredibly heroic. So there are citizens in this region who really do care, and I think that we can do something. But we need to have a separate track, right? We need to have, first of all, a humanitarian response, and that needs to really be done by the various countries. They all need to take their own steps. We need to address this issue very, very urgently. Then we need to think about the longer term solutions, and there I think it's also very urgent. We need to get together and really think about this mechanism to deal with this problem as a region. But you don't sit down and design this mechanism before you save people. Save people first.
How about the help from UN, EU, or other nations outside of ASEAN regions?
Well, the UN, of course, and particularly UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration. These are the two international agencies who really have the mandate internationally to deal with these problems of refugees, obviously for UNHCR, and migration more generally for IOM. They've been incredibly active, and they've all been working non-stop since this began. Again, I'd like to reiterate, this is not a new problem. They've been working on these issues for many years within this region, and on the Rohingya as well in particular. But I think that they do have, of course, have recommendations for these governments, which they are articulating. They've been making very strong recommendations about urgent steps that can be taken, principles that have to be adhered to in terms of non-refoulement, for example. That's one principle.
Right.
So that when refugees or asylum seekers come to a shore, they really should not be returned to a country in which they face persecution or danger. So these types of principles, the agencies are reminding the governments in this region to please respect international law, even if they're not signatory to the Refugee Convention. There's a lot of operational response by these agencies also. Certainly in Indonesia, where these boat people actually have been able to land, these two agencies are very active in both providing support through the government directly, and also trying to, in the case of UNHCR, actually trying to conduct interviews with these people to try to undergo what they call the refugee status determination process.
Right.
So that's already started. I do think that besides international organizations, we really need to come up with a response that's very well designed to the region. And we have ASEAN is still quite a young region as a political community, but we've been able to design institutions fairly recent institutions to respond to urgent crises. So I would give the example of the ASEAN frameworks and institutions which we have been able to design to respond to natural disasters. And that's really come about within the last 10 years. But we've made enormous steps towards improving our response as a regional community to natural disasters, both in terms of response, but also in terms of mitigation and prevention and preparedness. There's really been a lot that's been done coming up with a legally binding framework, actually. So, this can be done as well if we're really serious about trying to look at issues of refugee protection. We, of course, do have within ASEAN a framework, a draft convention, which hopefully will be completed by the end of the year, and will start being ratified by governments on trafficking.
Right.
And that's a very important step. But I would like to highlight that this is not just a trafficking issue. And as much as it is partly a trafficking issue, it is also a refugee issue. And that's why, those of us who really are advocates for a refugee approach in the region and a humanitarian approach say that the trafficking approach has to be complemented really by a refugee protection framework. And actually, if you really read, and I would urge everybody to actually go and read our ASEAN Charter and the ASEAN, the blueprints for the ASEAN community, in the political security blueprint, actually, as well as the social cultural blueprint, we do actually state that ASEAN will work together for humanitarian assistance of displaced populations, including refugees. So we've actually committed to things already. We do have the makings of a framework, a policy framework, to be able to work on these issues. It's really just about coming up with concrete ways forward, operational policies, mechanisms through which and principles through which we actually conduct our support for displaced people, refugees, and people in need, and humanitarian response in these situations. So we need to really start working on that as a matter of urgency. And I would say to ASEAN citizens, please urge your governments and tell your governments how much of a priority this is to ASEAN citizens. Malaysia, as the chair of ASEAN this year, we've made it a priority to try to call for a people-centered ASEAN.
Yes. And
at the summit, that was the theme of this. And I believe that's right. And people are starting to feel that ASEAN is a community that belongs to all of us, not just to the governments. And I think that's an important development. But now we really have to find a way to try to have these discussions and really constructively work together to find solutions to these incredibly challenging problems. And this, I think, is going to be an issue which defines the way that ASEAN moves together as a region.
Right.
If we fail at this, I think the entire ASEAN project will fail. We have to succeed at this because we all want ASEAN to succeed. It's not going to be easy, and I'm sure that we're going to make a lot of mistakes as we go along, but we have to try. And, there's no excuse to ignore these issues. I do believe that there's a political will from some of our governments to start thinking about really concretely what can be done. But, let's really try to move quickly on this because lives are at stake.
And at the same time, we as an ASEAN citizens, we also need to feel responsibility to help out these people, not just sitting and reading these all articles or just seeing all those photos. We really need to give our helping hands to those people on the boat at the moment.
Absolutely.
But, yes, but at the same time, there are also a certain group of people who's been just growing their doubts towards the ASEAN community because, like we mentioned before, ASEAN this year's logo is people-centered ASEAN. But with these issues raising up, people are just questioning where is this people-centered ASEAN community going towards?
Absolutely, and I think this is exactly what the governments need to realize. Our governments in the ASEAN region, they need to realize this is a matter of public trust as well. And if they do not respond in a way that the public feels is adequate, it's very blatant, right? You either save lives or you don't save lives. I mean, it's a very basic humanitarian issue, and ASEAN citizens are getting angrier and angrier as they watch this crisis grow, and I really have felt that as well. There's concern, there's a lot of outpouring, of course, people want to see a solution, but there's a level of, people are running out of patience, right? And I think that, the governments need to realize that. They need to realize that this is really going to become an enormous issue for public trust and accountability, and if there is going to be a way to work together constructively between governments and citizens, well, the governments need to find a way of reaching out to their citizens immediately and really convincing their citizens that they're trying to do the right thing. I think Thailand has taken some steps towards doing that. They've called a conference which is actually being organized now, and this was the Prime Minister herself who stood up and said, very early on actually, after these graves and camps were discovered, he really did crack down on trafficking and said immediately we need to have this international conference. Of course, then this boat crisis started, and it's been very difficult because, of course, the Thai Navy has also been not exactly conducting search and rescue, but they did try to give aid to some of the stranded boats, although perhaps not in the most appropriate manner. I'm sure everybody saw the images of these food packages being dropped into the water. So, and again, I think, the Malaysians, I have to say, I think conducted that in a much more dignified manner. We actually came to the boat and really handed packages over to people rather than drop them into the ocean where these poor refugees and migrants had to jump in to the ocean just to get a little bit of food to eat after they've been starving for days. So I think, again, we need to come up with some standards, some minimum standards, and let's really do this as a matter of urgency because, first of all, it's a matter of lives. Lives are at stake. And secondly, it's an incredible embarrassment that in ASEAN, at this point, we still, in spite of having actually now quite a good process to respond to natural disasters, if you look at, the ASEAN protocols for disaster response, it's actually quite good. Why can't we come up with some standards, some minimum, standard operating procedures in how we deal with migrants and refugees? I mean, I really don't think that is such a complicated thing to do. It shouldn't take years and 20 meetings of senior officials to be able to come up with that. I mean, I really think there are some simple things that we can apply already that exist in terms of standard operating procedures in dealing with these issues. So really, there should be absolutely no excuse. And again, as you pointed out, people are getting angry.
Yes.
And it has to be a way for the ASEAN governments to respond to that.
So, Lilianne, before we end our discussion and interview here, what is your message to our listeners? I mean, you have been repeating and also emphasizing your messages to people, but your last message to our listeners here, what can we do? What can we do to move forward as ASEAN community as well as ASEAN citizens?
I really think that citizens need to hold our governments accountable. I think we need to make it very clear to our governments that this is a matter of absolute urgency for our region, and people in the region want to see a solution, a regional solution to this problem. People are willing to help. I think the anger needs to be, clearly the anger is being expressed already. It's important to express that, but I do think it's also important for ASEAN citizens to really try to engage the governments in trying to help and offer the help. And I think ASEAN governments, for example, Malaysia, we have so many Rohingya refugees in the country right now. Please find a way to help these people more and give suggestions to citizens about what they can actually do. I think that communication needs to be much more transparent. It shouldn't be so ad hoc. We really need to try to resolve these issues. And there are many things that can be done at many levels. There's the humanitarian urgency of really getting these boats out of the sea as soon as possible, of giving them a treatment, the issue of really coming up with a policy framework to solve this crisis in the long term. But there's also immediate things that can be done just to help the refugees and people in the situation, the Rohingya who are already in our countries. What can we do to do that? There's so many Rohingya currently in Malaysia who are also still really in very, very desperate need, not just obviously the new arrivals, but also people who've been there for a long time. There's at least 40,000 Rohingya in Malaysia at the moment. Let's really have a dialogue about what Malaysia can do to support these people more as we come up with that longer term solution at the regional level.
Right. Okay. So that's the end of our interview here, Lilianne. Thank you so much for participating for our interview this morning, and hopefully our listeners can do something about it, not just reading article or just viewing the pictures, but do something, put in an action towards these issues that has been ongoing.
Thank you very much.